Here's the
Yeah.
I'm going to use the PowerPoint a little bit less than I do sometimes. I'm using it mostly to illustrate quotes. Just to give you a brief background before I actually start this morning, I teach theology to undergraduates. That's primarily what I do at a Lutheran college in the upper Midwest. About half of our students are Lutheran, 25% Roman Catholic, and the rest a variety of backgrounds. So that's the population of people that I engage with. The other group of people that I hang out with a lot are my friends, and they just happen to be professors over at the School of Medicine. Chair of Internal Medicine, I teach with an ER doc every term. We have a course called The Ragged Edge of Life, where theology and medicine meet, and we teach a lot of undergraduates. So these reflections are based on I think I live at the intersection. And literally, Augustana is sort of in the traffic way up to the Sanford School of Medicine. It used to be called the University of South Dakota School of Medicine until Denny Sanford donated $500 million to Sanford and to the School of Medicine, and so it's been renamed. Just to give you a quick insight, the incarnation is that Christian doctrine which talks about God becoming incarnate in the flesh. What that means not only in human flesh, but also in all of creation. And the Imago Dei means what it means to be created in the image of God. And I think those are key pieces to looking at how we understand human personhood and human life. So this presentation is going to explore then how we think and how we relate to the world as embodied persons. One of my favorite philosophers is Alfred North Whitehead. And in his little book called The Modes of Thought, he says the following. Something like, I don't walk into a room and say, hi, I'm Ann Peterson, I brought my body with me. Right? We are our body selves, and yet our very language precludes any sort of helpful way of talking about this. So we're going to talk today a lot about bodies. My body, your body. It should be simple and straightforward. After all, the body is in right now. It's all over everywhere. TV, magazines, the internet, in all forms of advertising. Bodies seem to be at the center. But the centrality of body doesn't mean it's easy to understand. And so the body or the human condition, I think, defies any kind of simplistic categorizations. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the practice and science of medicine. They reveal that we are, after all, messy and mysterious. We often talk about medicine and healthcare the same way we talk about science and religion, as if they are disembodied practices or abstract concepts. Instead, they are really practices done by specific people in specific places. That's what was so helpful about your presentation this morning, was to let the narratives of these famous people unpack how we understand science and religion. Medicine and the delivery of healthcare are cultural practices. They embody the values of our culture toward our bodies. Carl and I didn't plan this ahead of time, but much of what I talk about is how science and medicine are also embodied in our culture. For example, at the same time that we promote the health of the whole person, we sell body parts. We protect the rights of individuals with words like autonomy, but we forget the community of public health care. We improve and enhance some bodies while simultaneously ignoring and diminishing other parts. And we know that as consumers of health care, there is a moral obligation to help those around us. We expect our physicians to use every technological enhancement to prevent, cure, enhance, and overcome our limitations. When you think, I read a recent article about a man named Oscar Pistorius. Anybody recognize that name? The question is whether he will compete in the upcoming Olympics. He now has a prosthesis for the bottom part of his leg, which is made of titanium. And the question is that natural? He was born, I think, either without the bottom half of his legs or they were amputated early on. And now the question is, after enhancing his running ability, can he compete in the same way that other people are competing in the Olympics? So we try everything to change our bodies. We even fix soul, cell, and exchange bodies. For example, I know in South Dakota, You can buy sperm, but you can't sell eggs. That is changed in different parts of the United States. Also, the dominant culture tends to set standards of perfection, while those in the minority are forced to assimilate to those. There can be a sinister side of modern healthcare and medicine. And yet, medical science and biotechnologies have changed the face of illness for the better. Who would want to give up antibiotics, or having had a surgery a year ago that was done robotically, who would want to go back to the old way? Veterans whose limbs have been shattered by the tragedies of war can now find artificial limbs, prosthesis, and therapy. And the elderly whose joints have been worn down by age can have hip and knee replacements. I just had a friend that went through a knee replacement, and despite the pain, she is very much happier at the way she can walk. The NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, keeps alive premature babies who otherwise might have died. And there are targeted genetic therapies now specifically for people with certain kinds of cancer. Medicine then is a double-edged sword. It provides the care and extension of life for many, and yet it also seems to fail large populations of people who can't afford the care or simply who can't get the care. In South Dakota, let me tell you, distance is an issue. When you have to travel a couple hundred miles to a facility to get medical help, and as some of my friends have told me, they don't have the money to even fill their gas tank. So whether through direct interactions with those in healthcare and medicine or through its unavailability and absence for others, everyone is shaped by the stories that we tell about medical science and technology. The stories, however, are not simple. Arthur Frank is a character, a man whose reading I've begun to love. He's a medical sociologist. And he claims that stories that we tell about ourselves when we experience an illness are like stories that we take on journeys. They become our personal odysseys. Think of the time that you have gone through an experience of an illness or a surgery, and you always talk, there's almost an initiation point, a departure. You cross the threshold. Many times simply crossing the door into the hospital is crossing into another world. It reminds me of the time that I go on airports. Hospitals and airports seem to be the same kind of places. You're lost somehow in limbo in them. So on our quest for meaning on these journeys today, as we look at illness narratives, we'll ask ourselves about the practices of science and medicine and what we learn about what it means to be bodies. What kind of new awareness and insight will we develop about what it means to be a human person, for example, in light of medical sciences? For some of you, that may sound like an odd juxtaposition. Aren't humans persons? But are there other ways of being a person without being human? When do medical science and biology enhance life, making the world the wholesome place in which we live? When are other points when medical science and biotechnologies actually destroy or take away the life that God most fully wants us to live? So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is take you through 3 scenarios to help learn about our body selves through the images of science and biotechnology. The first one of these I'm calling techno-sapiens, or techno-flesh. The relationship that we are no longer Homo sapiens, but maybe we indeed are techno-sapiens, human beings that are so intricately related to the technology that we have, that we need to think about who we are as human creatures that way. When I think about all the technologies that surround us, I am transported into often what seems like another world. I grew up watching Star Trek. Anybody watch Star Trek? Star Trek Next Generation? This is an older room, so I can ask this things. Now I ask my students and they look at me like, ooh. You remember the character Spock, the ultimate embodiment of the rational, logical, empirical side of human life. He remained detached and objective of the most critical issues. He was half Vulcan, half human, a hybrid of sorts, a chimera of the human self. Commander Data then, in the next series, arrives with the crew of the Next Generation, an android whose goal was to become more human. You might remember at some time an emotion chip was planted in Data. Like Spock, he was the most intelligent of the crew, and yet his intelligence was created artificially. In an episode entitled The Measure of a Man, Data is legally declared to be an autonomous individual like all other humans on board the Starship Enterprise. He is no longer considered to be property. Data became almost human. The main characters of these great science fiction epics of the 20th century are androids, boards, and hybrids. Who are we? I claim that we too are data, cyborgs of co-created flesh and machine, nature and culture, body and God, biology and artificial. From the hours we spend on the internet, to the iPhones and droids we carry in our back pockets, to the glasses you have on your face, you are cyborg. In the early 1900s, a friend of mine who's chair of internal medicine said that most people died at home. She grew up in a small town in South Dakota. Her father was a funeral home director, her mother was a nurse, and her brother was an ambulance driver. She became a doctor, and her other brother was a funeral home director. They had quite the business. But she said in early 1900, most people, her statistics bear out of palliative care, that 90% of people died in their homes. Today, the opposite is true. 90% of us will die in an institution, most likely tethered to some sort of technology. This boundary in our lives between human and machine, artificial and natural, is difficult to distinguish. Maybe you have those days like I do, where I spent so much time on the internet, I'm not sure which reality I'm in, this one or the virtual one. We try to keep those opposites clean, machine and human, artificial and natural, but my claim is that they are much more ambiguous and messy than we'd like to think. Technology is most intricately and always connected inside of us, and therefore, I think, part of our sacred landscape. So when we ask what it means to be created in the image of God, we've got to understand who we are as human beings, and that this technology is so thoroughly woven into us that it has become part of our human identity. Let me give you a little example. I'm a 54-year-old married woman with no children. Recently, I had an experience that jarred my worldview. I attended the OBGYN grand rounds about pre-implantation genetic screening and diagnosis with a colleague and friend from my biology department. Many of you are probably aware of this, but during the part of the presentation, we watched the video of one cell being carefully extracted with a pipette from an 8-cell embryo. Dr. Diggins, my colleague, leaned over to me and said, "Isn't that the most amazing thing you've ever seen?" Her amazement and wonder at the body is contagious. I would even venture to say that her research in reproductive biology has become a religious experience for her. After all, she is an ex-Benedictine nun. It's ironic that an ex-Benedictine nun with no children and a 54-year-old woman with no children teach the only campus course in human reproduction at Orange County. I'm not sure why I'm so interested in science and technologies of reproduction, but I am entranced and blown away religiously by what I'm learning. I have questions that I will share with you, and I think they are religious questions. At what point in embryonic development does personhood start? How did the various forms of contraception interfere with the reproductive process in embryonic development? When are you pregnant? I have many of my freshmen that will say, well, you're pregnant at conception, but most physicians will say you're pregnant when? At implantation. What are the causes of infertility? What does one do with all these unused and unwanted embryos that are sitting in frozen storage bags? What is a parent? Is it the sperm donor, the biological father, the surrogate mother? What are different kinds of stem cells, and what are those doing for our knowledge about illness and disease? Should a couple, for example, have a second child as a source of stem cells to cure the first child with a disease? What will we find out about pre-implantation selection and elimination of genetically defective embryos? What further manipulations of the human genome will be possible? I cannot begin to understand what is happening in the sciences. I have one of those little Google alert sets. Some of you may set them on your computer. It's for stem cells that I have, and every day that I look at that, something new is coming across about what it means to consider the implications that are literally changing every day. Next year, when we change this course, I have a feeling there will be massive amounts of information that have once again changed our syllabus. Technology has reshaped everything we know about what it means to be born. More and more people are now being born through the means of artificial reproductive technologies. Children come into the world so prematurely that their lives have to be extended through the NICU. In a book called The Lazarus Case, Life and Death Issues in the Neonatal Intensive Care, John Lantos, a bioethicist at the University of Chicago, takes the reader through the story about one such baby in the NICU. Boy, that just kind of changed on its own. Here's the story that he tells about the NICU. He locates it in downtown Chicago. He said, the Sears Tower, temple of retailing, rising like a soaring bar graph above the rest. The Amoco building, built on energy oil, and the antitrust laws that broke up the Rockefeller oil monopoly into competing cartels, and the Hancock building, insurance, a monument to our efforts to escape the tyranny of chance. Those are the pieces that he links to the narrative about what it means to be human and what it means to be born in the world. If you come into the NICU, one of the first things that physicians think about is insurance and legal issues. And these cultural issues are shaping the religious rhetoric about what it means to be human. So the story, for example, about a premature baby in the NICU is told from the perspective of parents, physicians, nurses, other family, and caregivers. Decades ago, Lantos notes that the incubator was a technological wonder, and if you think about it, the incubator saved millions of babies' lives. And yet he said, when you walk into the NICU today, how many of you have been in the NICU and seen these tiny, tiny little babies? Sometimes you can hold in the palm of your hand. And he writes the following. There's probably no eerier place in the hospital than the NICU. And I remember this from the first time I was a chaplain. I walked into the University of Minnesota Hospital into the NICU and almost passed out. The babies, he says, are unimaginably tiny. They are magical. They look like something that the strange Life magazine pictures of babies inside the womb. The babies seem almost but not quite human, almost but not quite fetal. In their chimerical, half-human, half-machine state, they seem not only helpless and pitiful, but also exotic, threatening, futuristic, feral, untamed, and even barbarous. They evoke a strange sympathy, a mixture of sympathy and disgust. Their vulnerability calls out to us when we want to help them, but there is almost something repulsively bug-like about them that makes us want to obliterate them. They shouldn't be here, so vulnerable and so dependent on the machinery and technology of medicine. In a recent memoir that I read called This Lovely Life, a woman tells about the story of giving birth to twins at 23 weeks and the technological, personal, and social nightmare that this family goes through to keep these children alive, one whom lasts 4 days and the other 8 years. I'm amazed at these technological means of entering our life that tell us something about our relationship with our bodies. Our future has arrived. It's not somewhere out there in the next generation. We need to reflect, I think, as religious communities, to talk about what it means to be techno-flesh, to be techno-human. It is no surprise to Christians, and that's the tradition that I come out of, that the incarnation has always been used to talk about the person of Jesus Christ. But we also need to talk about incarnation, that the promise that God has become flesh, not only in Jesus, but in our flesh. And that flesh is incredibly messy and complicated. And we need to listen to the sciences when we understand what it means to talk about this flesh. Christians need to expand, I think, what it means to be understood to be created in the image of God. There are some theologians, and they're the aberrations again here, the outliers, who claim that if you're born by means of artificial reproductive technologies, because it is not natural, you are not fully human. And yet those voices permeate the discourse, at least around reproductive technologies. So I think part of my task as a Christian theologian, and the challenge I think to all faith communities, is to be fully engaged with the sciences around us as we listen and think about the claims of our faith. What does it mean then to be created in the image of God? I think we need to take aside this rather static picture that we have of the natural world. Somehow, when I have students, they say, well, nature's out here and we're human and there's this vast separation between. But what we have learned is that nature, technology, and humans are integrally part of the same world. And for Christians, part of that same world that God has created. So I would make a claim that we need to discard the static picture of nature that separates humans from technology, nature from humans, and instead looks at ourselves at the rather provocative title, I would claim, as techno-sapiens within techno-nature. This requires a more dynamic understanding of who we are, that human nature has never been fixed. Like the planets in the cosmos, neither is human nature fixed, but itself is always undergoing transformation of being. And we always need to ask ourselves what it means to be human, and consequently what it means to be created in the image of God. So techno-sapiens, one image. The next image I'd like to work briefly with is that of cancer. Statistics bear out that 1 in 3 people will get cancer in their lifetimes. How many of you know somebody currently who's going under treatment for cancer? Okay? Yeah. Statistic. For women, shows 1 in 8 women will have breast cancer. For prostate cancer for men, 1 in 6, I think the statistics now. These are 2 great quotes that I love. One from Susan Sontag, Illness as a Metaphor. She says, illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born old holds dual citizenship, in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place, where you cross the threshold into the land of the ill. Or from Arthur Frank, the wounded storyteller. The ill person who turns illness into story transforms fate into experience. The disease that sets the body apart from others becomes, in the story, the common bond of suffering that joins bodies in their shared vulnerability. So for now, we'll leave techno-flesh and move to talk about the second metaphor of cancer, which I think is one about suffering, about transformation, about hope, and belonging to community. As I noted, hardly any other illness affects more people in the world than cancer. And in fact, in the U.S. government, it was felt to be such a threat that in 1972, remember Richard Nixon declared, here again as his metaphor, war on cancer. The story of cancer in 21st century America is a multi-level, complicated plot with multiple characters. Cancer doesn't just affect individuals. For those of you who know somebody with cancer, it affects the whole family, friends, caregivers, and everyone. About 4 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 85 at the time. Her mother had died from breast cancer when she was 70-something. Her maternal aunt died of breast cancer, and her grandmother died of breast cancer, all though in their elderly years. I've had now 2 biopsies for suspicions of on mammograms. Amazingly though, since most of the women on my maternal side of the family were older when they were diagnosed, my own surgeon said I have as great a chance of getting breast cancer as the general population. This has not diminished for me though my anxiety every year when I go in for tests. At some level, all women wonder and worry about that test that gives them 1 chance in 8 of getting breast cancer. Laying face down on a table and being punctured by a large needle to extract cells from the suspicious site is an experience I don't want to repeat. However, the procedure was not nearly as painful as the couple of days that I waited to get the results. So when my mother was being diagnosed with breast cancer, we didn't initially worry about it too much. Many of the doctors said at your age you could die of something else. One even rather callously said you could get hit by a truck before you die of breast cancer. My mother got tired of being told at your age. So she crossed the threshold with me as her companion into that life from health to illness, and I also began to understand how age plays into all of this. That somebody who had a very healthy 85 years old and had just hiked 4 miles that previous summer in Yellowstone now entered into a world she didn't understand. When my mother received the final pathology reported for breast cancer, it was called HER2 positive and estrogen receptive. 2 terms that meant nothing to me. We had no idea what the physician had said. So being the person I am, I went on a rampage and read everything I could about her type of breast cancer, which even as her new surgeon said, at her age was the most aggressive kind she could have. Although she decided to not do normal chemotherapy, she did receive 7 weeks of radiation and a year of Herceptin treatments targeted toward her kind of cancer. We entered into the world of oncologists, radiologists, and patients we didn't even know existed. And while I was campus pastor, interim campus pastor that next year, over 4 people died at Augustana that year alone from cancer. We often act, because of that metaphor of warfare, as if cancer is something outside our bodies that invades us. And yet, ironically, cancer comes from the very cells that are inside of us. It is an evolutionary phenomenon. Robert Bazell, who writes a famous book on the making of Herceptin, writes the following. Our bodies are metaphors of who we are in nature, including all that is natural. Cancer, the uncontrollable multiplication of cells, has existed the moment that single-celled organisms join together to form multi-celled plants and animals. Growing and dividing is the most basic form of individual cells. It is the impulse by which life itself has survived and evolved for millions of years. Every cell in our bodies carries with it an evolutionary force. Some patients have a sense, however, that their own body itself is destroying them, and ironically, it feels personal. Spiritual issues arise. What have I done to cause this? Why has God done this? Family members will even goad them about old habits. If you have somebody in your family has smoked, you know the connection between lung cancer and smoking. I'm almost glad my father died of a heart attack at age 69 after having smoked 3 packs of Camels his entire life than to wait for lung cancer and be told, well, I told you so. On the other hand, if cancer is viewed as the invader from the outside, we use weapons like chemotherapy to target and destroy the invader. Chemotherapy is literally a kind of poison that comes and invades your body to destroy the tumors. And for many patients, chemotherapy is the ultimate weapon in the arsenal against cancer. We spend billions of dollars on the war against cancer, and we often neglect the limitations of how much more our bodies can sustain. My mom, who's a good friend at the place she lives at, is 89 and was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And the whole family discussion is, what do I do with these treatments? How much can my body take? How we see where cancer originates, whether it's on the outside or the inside, has much to do with how we understand those spiritual issues which arise within us. In a recent book called Speak the Language of Healing, Living with Breast Cancer Without Going to War, the author challenges traditional imagery of battle for going to war against your own body and going to war against cancer. The 4 women, all of whom had cancer, write the following about their experience. They don't surrender hope for a cure, but they also want to give up the notion that there's something alien inside their bodies. They understand, as Robert Bazell did, that cancer is an evolutionary phenomenon. It's part of who we are. It's part of the world that God created. They write, cancer was not an enemy to be vanquished. It is part of who we are. So instead of treating their bodies like war zones to be targeted, they treated their bodies with compassion and acceptance. Approximately 1 in 8 women, as I noted, will have breast cancer. And it is the second leading cause of death for women. Women are not statistics in a war any more than men are statistics in this war on cancer. Cancer becomes personal and it becomes spiritual. On this journey with my mother, I went through things that I never thought would happen. On those daily trips to the radiation center, we were put in what felt sort of like holding area before my mom would go in for she now has those little permanent tattoos on her body. And we would wait in this room before she would go on, and I remember being unbelievably touched by a woman who was going through cancer at the time, and she said, "Let me show you something." And she lifted her shirt up and showed the massive burns that she had gone through in radiation. Other women would sit silently and simply wait in the room, but everybody in that room, caregiver and patient, intimately knew something was going on with their bodies. My mother never lost her hair, was never burned, and frankly tolerated the side effects well. At 89 years old now, she only goes back in for 6 months checkups. No doctor appointments, no blood work, no scans, except for every 6 months. At least for the time being, I'm grateful. And I'm also grateful for the life of somebody else who has helped to make her life special. And that's a little mouse. Anybody heard of OncoMouse? Patented by DuPont. It's a laboratory mouse that has been genetically modified, carrying a specific gene called an oncogene. The gene makes this mouse susceptible to breast cancer. OncoMouse is the first patented animal in the United States. She is a metaphor for me of technoscience and techno-nature. We buy, sell, and experiment and patent animals. Of course, the story of the lab mouse is not so simple, and neither is the self-understanding of the humans who have created it. The story about OncoMouse emerges like the self-understanding of the disease of breast cancer through complex interactions of technology, nature, economics, politics, machine, and humans. These stories from biotechnology and medical science are connected to our cultural narratives. OncoMouse tells much about who we are, and now there's all kinds of debates in the culture about patenting not only animals, but patenting our genes. One of the tests for breast cancer runs $3,000 to $4,000, and it's being challenged in courts right now because of the patenting of genetic material. We learn something about who we are from these narratives of cancer. Cancer also reveals the pathologies of our culture. We know that race and economic status shape who and when someone gets cancer, who receives treatment, and how research monies are needed. In South Dakota, there are extremely high rates of cervical cancer on reservations. A friend of mine who's a gynecological oncologist is studying that, and they don't know exactly what's going on, but part of it clearly is that women don't even get tested. They don't have the access to get tested. The privilege of race, class, and gender leave behind those who are part of what we call the normal majority. Why do some people receive better treatment than others? As I mentioned, even in South Dakota, we forget that transportation is an issue. To get from the reservation to good medical facilities requires money to put gas in the car. Even meeting the expenses of recurring deductibles with people with good health care insurance can create extreme hardship. I have a friend who died recently of cancer, and she talked about it in Augustana's health plan. If you go to a doctor, it's a $20 copay. If you go to a specialist, it was $40 a copay. And she was going multiple times a month, recurring hundreds of dollars a month, simply in copays. I would also love to think that cancer no longer holds a stigma for those who hold it. And yet when I've talked to multiple people who have gone through chemotherapy, they still talk about the stares that they have when they go into grocery stores, when they wear their wigs, and those who think of them as somehow still untouchable. People still don't know what to say to those who have cancer. Cancer, for many ways, is still a stigma. Physicians practice, and we need to tell those stories. One of the things that I think is so remarkable is a little word that religion and medicine both share, anamnesis. Some of you physicians in the room, you'll know what an anamnesis is, and so will theologians. It's the practice of recalling events, of telling stories. Physicians practice anamnesis when they have patient tell their story. Christians do it in the Eucharistic liturgy when they recall the ways that congregations listen to and enter into the participation of the pastoral mystery. In both examples, recall and memory and telling a story is one way to create community, one way of talking about being human. The way I learned a great deal about anamnesis was a couple of years ago when I gathered every Monday with a group of women. I was the interim campus pastor, and at that point I mentioned there were multiple people people in Augie's community, our assistant dean of students, the director of our Center for Western Studies, and 2 secretaries, all undergoing treatment for terminal cancer. So we decided to gather a group of us that would meet once a week for a writing group. And it was led by a friend of mine, Dr. Mary Ellen Harris, who's an ER physician. And she had been trained in this process of anamnesis, literally getting people to tell their stories. So we would gather every Monday first for coffee, and then we would spend 20 minutes or so writing. She would give us a writing prompt. Sometimes the word was just something simple. If it was a Thanksgiving time, I remember we wrote about the word turkey. And for 20 minutes, we did just an unfolding of our own writing, and then we shared those writings in this group. Over time, over a year, we gathered together, and the anamnesis, or the telling of those stories, shaped that group into a way in which I began to experience that group as church, as a place where we lived out the story of one another's lives about suffering, about transformation, and about hope. Some of the themes remained constant. We all talked about bodies, whether it was their own body going through chemo or the bodies of the caretakers and the people that we were around. But those stories are ones I will never forget. What does it mean then for Christians specifically to be part of the body of Christ, this place that we call church? I cannot give a simple answer to that response, and I think that sometimes churches fail us. That's why I think this forum is so important, that a church itself puts its name on the place where we gather to talk about science and religion. The body of Christ, after all, is a metaphor about community, about what it means to be human. What is church? First of all, I would say it's a place where we experience suffering and offering, where we understand each other's stories, and I think most radically in today's world, where we can extend hospitality. One of the best descriptions of hospitality that I've come across has been used in medicine, again from Arthur Frank. He calls this language one of medical generosity. He writes a book called The Renewal of Generosity, and he says, "My book is about what I consider fundamental medicine, face-to-face encounters between people who are suffering bodily ills and other people who need both the skills to relieve the suffering and grace to welcome those who suffer. Medical generosity lacks in the latter quality, the grace to welcome those who suffer. And as much as I'd like to think that the church can be one of those places, it too has often failed." So what I think we need to think about is overcoming our fear of suffering, of our bodies when they aren't necessarily perfect, when there are places when we can enter into church and be fully who we are. Hospitality then becomes both in medicine and in religion a place to practice radical hospitality, a place of experiencing amazing grace. I want to tell you a brief story about such amazing grace. I mentioned to a couple people last night that, and you have mentioned, I wrote a book with Arthur Peacock. When I first met Arthur, he was one of those people that, at least for me across the pond, was sort of intimidating. 2 PhDs. In fact, he did his PhD in biochemistry, and he even said that he did some bench light work in his undergrad days with Margaret Thatcher. He had 2 PhDs, one in biochemistry and one in theology, and I knew Arthur and was introduced to him through a friend, and the first time we met, we talked about music. And then I found out that his wife was one of Her Majesty's inspectors of the schools, and my husband was an educator, and over the next few years, we became friends and spent a lot of time together. We had wonderful meals, and I remember going to their home in the center of Oxford, and the first time that we had breakfast with them, we stayed overnight, we got up the next morning, and the table had been set with flowers, with silver, and with napkins, and Arthur came to breakfast in his shirt and tie. At first I wondered if this was just odd British manners, and what I realized is that for Arthur, it was extravagant hospitality. That every time we were in their home, they shared the greatest things that they had with us. And on one last trip to Oxford in 2006, Arthur had been diagnosed with cancer and was receiving pain medication in a hospice. And he asked if I would come. I was at another Templeton lecture, and a group called the International Society for Science and Religion, and he asked if I would go to the lectures and come back and tell him what had happened that day. So I went to the lectures, and Rosemary, his wife, said, "I'm going to take you to the hospice." And this was a hospice experience that I hadn't quite seen in the United States. I went to the building. It was a big, magnificent round building with beautiful British gardens in the middle. And the trolley cart, as Arthur reminded them, delivered sherry every afternoon and evening through the hospice. And in the courtyard, the lung cancer patients were allowed to smoke in the beautiful gardens, many of them in their last weeks of life with their last pleasures. The extravagant hospitality of this hospice setting made life bearable for those who were dying. In his last days, while Arthur was dying, his doctor suggested, I thought this was fascinating, his own internal medicine doctor suggested that he write something. And so these are the words that Arthur wrote during his last years. The irony is that he worked on DNA and worked on cancer, the very illness which would take his life. He writes the following: "Over the years, I have given much thought and spilled much ink on the nature of God and God's interaction with people. Not surprisingly, the subtle nuances of my deliberations have fallen away before the absolute conviction that God is love, and eternally so. This remains the foundation for my thoughts and prayers, for underneath are the everlasting arms." Arthur's honesty freed in me the necessary hospitality that I would then share with others. I think if I had not gone through with that when I was in relationship with my mother going through that cancer, I would not have understood it. But this radical hospitality in letting me share in that dying process also helped me to understand that absolute conviction of God's love and the full embodiment of what it means to experience incarnation. So what do we learn then from cancer about being human? Some summary thoughts about cancer. What I have learned from cancer is that it is a metaphor for what it means to be human, that we can't control everything in life, that we are not God. We realize that the very powers in the world that create life are also those which destroy life. We come to know the way we live is the way we die, and that the way we die is the way we have lived. I have a palliative care friend who said, you can tell how somebody will die by how they have lived. Healing and transformation is very much a social process that comes through love and community. And healing requires knitting together what was severed. Gender and sexuality, for example, for people who have been through breast cancer. And healing also requires compassion, which requires admission of our own frailties and our own finitude and being faced with our own death. Healing requires retraining, re-educating our bodies before our minds can catch up with our bodies. Healing comes through communities, through love, and through empowerment. This experience with Arthur of extravagant hospitality offered an insight into me about what it means to be church, what it means to understand God's love, and most of all, what it means to understand incarnation. That we are bound to each other in narratives of suffering and death and life and transformation. And when we enter most fully into those, we know most fully what it means to be human. I think I have about 5 minutes left, so I will try to be brief here. The last metaphor that I leave you with is bodies at the end of life. All of us, as I know now, fully at 54, almost 55, get older and die. It's the human condition. The young 20-somethings that I teach, thankfully, are not aware of this most days. And yet, in our communities, we sell multiple creams, laser surgeries, dyes, and ointments to counteract the effects of aging. I read something last year about the billions of dollars that Americans spent just simply on anti-aging products. Aubrey de Grey, who's a British scientist and engineer, is part of a movement of transhumanism to what he calls combating the disease of aging. He claims that our bodies are simply machines, and if we can fix the parts at the cellular level, like telomeres, we can usher in a new immortal lifetime for people, living maybe 500 to 1,000 years. He hopes to get rid of the culture of the expense of fragility and aging, and through his scientific research, benefits could come, cures for cancer, for example. However, I worry that a culture that is already so obsessed with youth and perfection will find more reasons already to ignore those who are vulnerable, frail, and alone. The science of extending the human lifespan seems to feed humans' longing for immortality. And here I'm saying immortality, not resurrection. But for Christians, this isn't enough. The resurrection of the body and the promise of eternal life through Christ about the now are about the now and the not yet, about this world and the next. The human person is not simply a set of components, a few parts that can be fixed. Neither are we simply an outer shell that's cast off when our true self will go to heaven. The Christian doctrine of the resurrection bodily challenges this view of the body as parts. Christianity claims that there will be a new heaven and a new earth, not just an extension or more of what we already are, but something radically and truly new. Indeed, according to the book of Colossians, all will be made new heaven and new earth. The human body self will be transformed. And yet, even physicians who teach in medical schools challenge DeGray's notion that the human body is simply machine. Like DeGray, while they study the parts, they also realize that the human person is much more, and that this mystery of the more is what makes them human. In a recent film I watched called Departures, and I would recommend that to everyone. It was, I think, won the 2010 Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, set in Japan about a young man working with cremation of bodies. And this beautiful rendition about what happens to the body when it dies. Another book that I would recommend is one called Body of Work by Christine Montross. She talks about her first experiences in medical school working with cadavers. When she first meets the cadaver that she had, she ponders the parts that she dissects, and she writes, as she carries her body of bones with her. She said, the box bumps against my leg as I take it to the car. During the entire walk, I am thinking this used to be a person in this box, and no one knows it. Although the cadaver is obviously dead, Montross learns as much about life and about its mysteries. She reminds us that we really don't know as much as we think about dying and the definition of death. I still cringe on TV shows like Grey's Anatomy when they go in and tell the patients, well, you're brain dead, but, and then that word but comes in. Brain death is death. And yet, for many of us, the boundary between life and death is so nebulous. In a provocative statement, Montross writes the following. Scientifically, I side with neurologists who designate death as the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain. Philosophically, I wade into murky and controversial matters with personal beliefs that the boundaries of death are nebulous. To me, the definition of dead may extend far enough toward life to include a person whose brain is physically functional, void. The end-stage Alzheimer's patient, for example, who never wakes but breathes and sends urine from injected fluid into her diapers. The boundaries then for us I think, blur between life and death. That's part of the rhetoric about cases like Terri Schiavo. What exactly is life? What exactly is death? And people and physicians like Montross are saying they're much more nebulous than we think. An 8-cell embryo, somebody with Alzheimer's, there's a huge continuum. Our life story shares with us the fact that these boundaries about who we are in the world are much messier than we ever thought. So I want to leave you with just a few concluding thoughts. What have I learned about myself, and maybe what have you learned about being a body self? About the body and blood that are given to me by God the Creator. A Christian perspective should welcome the discussions with medicine and biotechnology that offer healing and hope to those whose lives are cut short by debilitating disease and suffering. They should claim the reality that life and death are not in the ultimate control of humans, and they can claim that it is precisely in these bodies that we are that God works in our world. Our bodies are a mystery, and our response to that mystery, I think, should be one of awe, of wonder, and humility. The more we learn about our bodies from the medical sciences, I think the more humility we need about what we do with that knowledge. The human body self is a work in progress. What is happening in medical sciences and biotechnologies is moving at such a fast pace that most of us don't know how to keep up with it, let alone how our theology keeps up with it. What it means to be a human body self then is a work in process, a process, I think, of translation and of interpretation, of asking what it means to say that the word becomes flesh. I think we are technosapiens, body selves, constructing our meaning of life, in, with, and under through the technologies around us. The categories and boundaries that once helped us understand who we are and who we were, and what makes up our body selves don't seem to work so well anymore. We can only understand who we are as we place ourselves then in other people's stories, and other people's narratives, paying attention to their details and to their lives. We, after all, are mortal and finite, and that is part of what it means to be human. What we do with that seems to be up for grabs. One of the most important lessons I have learned from reading memoirs of those who have had cancer is that compassion and hospitality might be the most important things we can know about what it means to be